Yet on the afternoon of my 70th birthday, I stood alone inside my sprawling suburban estate, and the quiet pressed down like a weight. My beloved wife Nadine had been gone 4 years by then. Without her in it, that grand house was little more than a cold museum, every gleaming mahogany surface and crystal chandelier a monument to a life that once had warmth and breath. The time was 3:00 in the afternoon. Welcome back to Dad Revenge, the place where loyalty is rewarded and betrayal always finds its way home. If stories like this one speak to something deep in you, I would be grateful if you stayed with me by hitting subscribe and leaving a like. It lets me know these stories are reaching the right people. And before we go any further, are you listening on headphones today or through a speaker? For a story this close to the bone, I always think you want it right in your ear. One more thing before we begin: some elements of this story have been shaped for the purpose of narrative. Any resemblance to real persons or events is entirely coincidental. What matters is the truth underneath it. I stood at the bay window of my study, watching autumn leaves drift across the manicured lawn. I reached for my cell phone and dialed my son Colton. 38 years old, my only child, and the current acting chief executive officer of the company I had built with my own 2 hands. 2 years ago, I had handed him the reins, convinced he was ready to carry the Whitfield legacy forward. We had a tradition for my birthday, one that had never once been broken. Every year without fail, we would make our way to the prime rib downtown and share a porterhouse and a bottle of good scotch. I dialed his private line. It rang 4 times before he finally picked up. His voice was clipped, breathless, threaded with a manufactured urgency that set my teeth on edge immediately. "Dad, I am so sorry, but I am completely buried right now," Colton said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, as though he had just slipped out of a high-stakes boardroom. "We have a massive crisis with the new warehouse acquisition. The sellers are trying to back out at the 11th hour, and I am trapped in an emergency corporate merger meeting. The lawyers are breathing down my neck. I cannot make dinner tonight. I am trying to save this company. Dad, I really am." I held the phone to my ear, listening to the faint hum of background noise. Part of me, the father who always wanted to believe the best of his son, pushed down the swell of disappointment. I knew the crushing weight of corporate responsibility. I knew what it was to have millions of dollars and hundreds of livelihoods resting squarely on your shoulders. I thought back to those early days 40 years ago, when Whitfield Logistics was nothing more than 2 second-hand freight vans with bald tires. I remembered coming home smelling of motor oil and sawdust, finding Nadine seated at the kitchen table paying our bills with pennies. I remembered the year the banks nearly foreclosed on us, and my sweet Nadine quietly sold her diamond wedding ring just to keep Colton enrolled in his elite private school. We had given up our youth, our sleep, and our peace of mind so that our son would never know that kind of struggle. If Colton was now fighting to protect that legacy, how could I hold anything against him? I swallowed my pride, along with the heavy lump of loneliness rising in my throat. "I understand, Colton," I replied, keeping my voice steady and measured. "The business has to come first. You do what you need to do to secure that deal. We can always celebrate my birthday next week. Just make sure your legal team reviews the indemnification clauses before anyone signs anything." "Thanks, Dad. You are the best. I promise I will make it up to you," he said quickly. And then the line went dead. I set the phone down and stared at the darkened screen. The house felt even larger now, the ticking of the antique long-case clock in the corridor echoing like a metronome measuring out my remaining years. I walked into the kitchen, an enormous expanse of marble and stainless steel, and stared at the bare countertops. For a moment I entertained the thought of making myself a simple sandwich, settling in front of the television, and letting the milestone of my 70th year dissolve in total solitude. But I am Gerald Whitfield. I had not survived decades in the cutthroat trenches of commercial real estate by drowning in self-pity. Right then and there, I decided I was not going to spend my 70th birthday eating cold cuts alone in an empty house. If I had to mark the occasion by myself, I would do it with dignity. I would go to the prime rib, order my favorite steak, raise a glass of the finest scotch to the memory of my dear Nadine, and reflect on everything I had built. I went upstairs to the dressing room and selected a bespoke navy wool English suit. I dressed with care, straightening my deep cobalt silk tie and fastening my heirloom silver pocket watch. I studied my reflection in the full-length mirror. My hair had gone silver, and the lines carved into my face were a record of countless boardroom battles, but my posture was ramrod straight. People make the dangerous mistake of assuming an old man is a weakened one. They see the gray hair and presume the fangs have dulled. I was about to discover just how deeply my own family had underestimated me. I took my keys and stepped out into the crisp Philadelphia evening. The drive into the city was smooth, the sky deepening into shades of violet and bruised orange. As I moved through the familiar streets of downtown Philadelphia, my thoughts drifted to Colton. A surge of fatherly pride rose in me. I could picture him in some tense boardroom collar, loosened battling lawyers and executives to defend the family name. I had handed him a kingdom, and I wanted nothing more than to watch him reign wisely. He had always been somewhat easily swayed, a little too hungry for approval, especially after he married Renata. Renata was 34 with a polished, gentle exterior that concealed a brilliant and calculating mind. I had never fully trusted her. She had an appetite for luxury that edged toward excess, constantly pushing Colton to upgrade their cars, their vacations, their social standing. And then there was her mother, Cordelia, a 60-year-old woman who clung stubbornly to the fiction of high society despite having squandered her own late husband's fortune years before. But they were Colton's family now, and I had always worked to keep the peace. I pulled up to the valet stand outside the prime rib. The young attendant opened my door with a respectful nod. The familiar comforting scent of roasted garlic, aged beef, and expensive cologne drifted through the heavy wooden doors. I breathed it in, steadied myself for a solitary evening, and walked inside. The maitre d', a gentleman who had known me for 20 years, recognized me at once. "Mr. Whitfield," he smiled warmly. "A very happy birthday to you, sir. Will you be dining at your usual private booth this evening?" "Yes, Douglas, just me tonight," I replied, passing him my coat. I followed him through the dimly lit, elegant dining room, wrapped in the soft murmur of conversations and the music of clinking crystal. We moved past the bustling bar and out toward the center of the main floor. And that was when my entire world abruptly stopped turning. There, at a prime center table bathed in the warm glow of a crystal chandelier, sat my son. Colton was not in any boardroom. He was not hunched over a corporate merger, sweating through his collar. He was dressed in a custom-tailored, deep burgundy wool blazer, laughing uproariously, a glass of wine in his hand. To his right sat his wife Renata, draped in expensive silk. Directly across from him was her mother Cordelia, clapping her hands with delight. My feet turned to lead. The air left my lungs completely. The center of the table was a spread of extravagance. A towering seafood arrangement, imported caviar, thick cuts of Wagyu beef. And resting in a silver ice bucket was a bottle of French Bordeaux that I recognized from the wine list, upwards of $4,000. They were deep in a lavish celebration. They were celebrating my 70th birthday without me spending my money on the very night my son had sworn he was desperately working to save our company. I did not shout. I did not march over and overturn the table. I stepped back into the shadow of a wide mahogany pillar, caught the maitre d's eye, and had him seat me in a booth directly behind them, completely outside their line of sight. I settled into the darkness, ordered a black coffee, and listened as the betrayal laid itself bare. Cordelia leaned forward, her voice cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of the room. "How much longer until the old fossil signs the power of attorney?" she asked, swirling her wine. "I have already hired interior designers for his suburban mansion. It needs a complete overhaul." Colton chuckled, slicing into his steak with a casual cruelty that chilled me. "Relax, Cordelia. The old man's mind is slipping anyway. One signature on Friday, and we will toss him into Glenbrook memory care by Monday. He will not even realize what hit him. My blood turned to ice. My hands clenched the porcelain coffee cup so tightly my knuckles went white. They were not simply leaving me out of my own birthday. They were plotting to strip away everything I had spent my life building and have me locked away. I waited in the shadows until their waiter arrived with the final bill. It came to $6,500. I watched Colton reach casually for his black corporate American Express card, the one drawn directly from my primary business account. I finally stepped out of the darkness. The three of them froze, faces draining to ash, as I smoothly lifted the black card from the waiter's tray. I looked directly at the restaurant manager and spoke in a cold, level voice. Cancel this transaction. I am the primary account holder and this card has just been reported stolen. They will cover the $6,500 bill from their personal accounts. Colton stammered, his face draining of all color, knowing full well his personal accounts were maxed out. I looked at Renata, and Cordelia smiled coldly and walked out of the restaurant. In life, there is a dangerous misconception that old age equates to weakness. People assume that because a man's hair turns gray, his mind goes soft and his fangs lose their edge. But my son had forgotten one vital truth. You do not endure 50 years in the trenches of the corporate world by being soft or naive. True strength is not about raising your voice when you have been wronged. It is about holding perfectly still, gathering your evidence, and striking only when every card in the deck belongs to you. Never mistake a father's patience and love for stupidity. A sleeping wolf is still a wolf. The ambient hum of the restaurant faded into a dull ringing in my ears. I stood completely frozen on the plush carpet of the main dining room. Douglas, the maitre d', had taken 2 steps before he realized I was no longer at his heels. He turned, a polite question forming on his lips, but the words died the moment he followed my gaze. There, at the center of the room, beneath the grandest crystal chandelier, sat a table that commanded every eye in the place. The finest table in the house. And occupying it, radiating a careless arrogance, was my son. Colton was not in a corporate suit. He was not hunched over some high-stakes logistics merger, collar loosened and brow damp. He was wearing a custom-tailored deep burgundy wool blazer. He reclined in his leather chair like a portrait of pure leisure, cradling a delicate glass of dark red wine. He threw his head back and let out a booming, carefree laugh that sliced through the refined atmosphere of the steakhouse. It was a laugh stripped of all stress. The laugh of a man without a single weight on his shoulders, let alone a failing acquisition. My mind strained to reconcile the figure before me with the frantic voice I had heard on the phone just hours earlier. He had told me the lawyers were breathing down his neck. He had told me he was fighting to save the company I had built. Yet here he was, holding court like a minor prince at his own banquet. The sheer audacity of the lie struck me with the force of a physical blow. A sharp, hollow ache opened in my chest. It was the grief unique to a father who has watched his only child look him dead in the eye and lie without flinching. Seated to his right was his wife, Renata. She looked radiant, draped in an emerald green silk dress that caught and held the low light of the room. Her dark hair was styled to perfection, cascading over her shoulders as she leaned in to murmur something to Colton. Her manicured fingers rested lightly against the velvet of his sleeve. Her expression was one of deep, self-satisfied triumph. I had always known Renata had a taste for the finer things, but watching her bask in the glow of a stolen evening confirmed every quiet doubt I had ever carried about her character. Directly across from them, clapping her hands with undisguised delight, sat Renata's mother, Cordelia. Cordelia was a woman who practically breathed entitlement. She wore a heavy pearl necklace and a sharply cut designer blazer projecting an image of generational wealth that I knew for a fact she did not possess. Her late husband had left her a mountain of hidden debts and a fractured estate. Yet she had always paraded through Philadelphia high society as though she owned the city. Tonight her face was flushed with wine and victory. She raised her glass toward Colton in a loud, theatrical toast. My eyes moved from their smiling faces to the table itself. The spread was staggering. At the center of the crisp, white linen sat a towering, multi-tiered silver platter of iced seafood, plump lobster tails, colossal shrimp, freshly shucked oysters resting on beds of crushed ice. Beside it, a delicate glass bowl of imported beluga caviar sat alongside mother-of-pearl spoons. Two massive, dry-aged bone-in Wagyu ribeyes were arranged before Colton and Renata, glistening with herb butter, flanked by truffle mashed potatoes and an array of lavish sides. But it was the wine that truly anchored the reality before me. Resting in a silver chilling bucket beside the table was a bottle of Chateau Margaux. I recognized the vintage immediately. A legendary Bordeaux, the kind that commands upward of $4,000 at a restaurant of this caliber. I knew this because it was the precise vintage I had set aside to celebrate my 50th wedding anniversary with Nadine, a milestone we never lived to reach. They were feasting like royalty with absolutely no restraint. And then the darkest realization of all washed over me. Today was my 70th birthday. This was no ordinary Friday dinner. They had gathered at my favorite restaurant, eating my preferred food, drinking exquisite wine to mark my milestone, but with every deliberate effort made to leave me out. They had intentionally excluded me from my own celebration. I stood in the shadow of a wide mahogany pillar and let the bitter truth settle into my bones. Colton had not simply been too busy for dinner with his aging father. He had constructed a lie with care and purpose. He had fed me a story about corporate emergencies and failing mergers to ensure I remained locked inside my empty mansion. He wanted me absent, out of sight and out of mind, so he could enjoy the fruits of my labor alongside his wife and her parasitic mother. The financial dimension followed close behind the emotional wound. His personal finances were a wreck. I knew this because I had reviewed his accounts quietly when he first took the role of chief executive officer. He lived well beyond his means, perpetually stretching to satisfy Renata's appetite for luxury. He could not have funded a $10,000 evening from his own pocket. There was only one explanation for how this feast was being financed: the corporate credit card. My card. The very card tied to the business he had sworn he was sacrificing his evening to protect. He was using my life's work to bankroll a celebration of my life, while deliberately leaving me to sit alone in the dark. The audacity was breathtaking. The cruelty was surgical. A hot, suffocating wave of rage rose in my chest, pushing past the initial shock. I thought of Nadine. I thought of the countless nights I had sat awake at the kitchen table running numbers, trying to make payroll for my drivers. I thought of the weekends, missed the vacations, deferred every sacrifice we had made to construct a fortress of security for our son. We had placed the keys to that kingdom in his hands, free of every hardship we had endured to build it. And this was his gratitude. This was how he honored what we had made. Douglas, the maitre d', stepped quietly back to my side. His professional composure faltered as he took in the full picture: my son at the table, my birthday, the empty booth waiting for me in the rear, and the lavish feast playing out at center floor. "Mr. Whitfield," Douglas whispered, his voice freighted with sympathy, "would you like me to show you to your table? Or perhaps I can ask them to step outside." I did not answer right away. I drew a slow breath, pressing the violent storm in my chest down into something cold and deliberate. I studied Colton as he lifted a cut of Wagyu beef to his mouth, chewing with his eyes closed, as though he were experiencing some profound revelation. The ease of his posture, the utter relaxation of it, made the blood pound hard in my temples. Rather than cross the floor and make a spectacle of myself, I held my position. A sudden, overwhelming need to understand the full scope of this deception took hold of me. I had to know exactly what game my own son was running. I raised my hand slowly, signaling Douglas to stop where he stood. He halted, brow creasing in confusion. I drew back into the deeper shadow of the corridor and motioned for him to follow. When he was close enough, I leaned in and spoke in a low, controlled tone. "I do not want them to know I am here, Douglas. Put me in the high-backed corner booth directly behind them, the one facing the wall." Douglas hesitated for the briefest moment, his loyalty visibly caught between the obligations of a long-standing patron and the uncomfortable reality of a family in crisis, but he was a consummate professional. He gave a silent nod and guided me around the outer edge of the dining room. We moved like ghosts through the low light skirting the main pathways until we arrived at the large, semicircular leather booth positioned directly behind Colton's table. The back of the booth rose high enough to conceal me entirely from anyone seated at the center. I slid into the soft leather, turning to face the dark oak paneling of the wall. Douglas offered me a menu, but I simply shook my head and requested a cup of black coffee. No sugar, no cream. I sat perfectly still in the shadows. My booth was near enough to theirs that I could detect the faint clinking of silverware against porcelain plates. Their voices drifted over the leather partition with a sickening, unobstructed clarity. I shut my eyes and directed every bit of my attention to their conversation, bracing myself for whatever justification Colton might produce for this betrayal. Perhaps he had been trying to impress his demanding mother-in-law. Perhaps Renata had forced his hand. I was foolishly hunting for a silver lining that simply was not there. The waiter approached their table to refill the wine glasses. I heard the pour, followed by Cordelia releasing a long, slow sigh of satisfaction. "And this Bordeaux is absolutely divine, Colton," she said, her voice thick with manufactured sophistication. "It is certainly a step up from the swill your father usually serves at his dreary holiday dinners. You really must tell him to upgrade his wine cellar." Colton laughed, a light, effortless sound that made my stomach turn. "I will be sure to pass along your critique, Cordelia, though I doubt he would appreciate the subtleties of a vintage like this anyway. He is a meat and potatoes kind of guy. Always has been." I drew a slow breath. The disrespect stung, but it was nothing set against what came next. "Well, he will not have to worry about his wine cellars for much longer, will he?" Cordelia asked, her tone pivoting cleanly from playful to sharply businesslike. "Tell me, Colton, how much longer until the old fossil finally signs the power of attorney? I am growing terribly impatient." My heart stopped. I stopped breathing entirely. The power of attorney. What power of attorney? I had never once discussed surrendering my legal rights or my financial independence. I had stepped aside as CEO, yes, but I retained full ownership of my assets and my estate. That had never changed. I have already hired those expensive interior designers from New York for his suburban mansion. Cordelia pressed on, the excitement barely contained in her voice. They sent me the preliminary sketches this very morning. We are going to completely gut the main floor. The dark wood paneling has to go. It is incredibly depressing. We will open the space right up, put in floor-to-ceiling windows, perhaps a modern marble fireplace. It is going to cost a fortune, but it will finally feel like a home fit for hosting my social circle. I stared at the dark wall in front of me. My hands closed slowly into fists, my fingernails pressing painfully into my palms. Cordelia was discussing my home, the house I had built with Nadine, the house where we had raised our son together. She intended to hollow it out, to erase every trace of my wife and transform it into a sterile showroom for her circle of bankrupt admirers. Colton did not defend his childhood home. He offered no word in defense of my legacy. He simply chuckled and lifted his wine glass for another easy sip. "Relax, Cordelia," my son said, his voice smooth and perfectly composed. "The old man's mind is slipping anyway. He is getting forgetful, confused. You should see him at the office. He barely comprehends the new logistics software. I have the documents drawn up and ready. One signature on Friday, and we will move him into Glenbrook Memory Care by Monday. He will not even realize what hit him until he is sitting in a wheelchair eating pureed peas." Glenbrook Memory Care. A bleak, cheerless facility on the outskirts of the city, notorious for its hollow atmosphere and bare minimum standards of care. the kind of institution where families deposited elderly relatives when they had grown too inconvenient to keep in sight. My own son was scheming to lock me away in a featureless room simply to seize immediate control of everything I owned. He was constructing a false narrative about my mental deterioration to strip my wealth from me while I was still breathing. A sharp physical pain knifed through my chest, burning like a live coal pressed against my ribs. My blood turned to absolute ice. The waiter returned to my booth in silence and set a steaming cup of black coffee on the table in front of me. I did not look at him. My eyes were fixed on the wooden paneling, but what they saw was something else entirely the past. I saw a cramped, freezing apartment from 30 years ago. I saw a pile of overdue bills stacked on a wobbly kitchen table. I felt again the hollow desperation that gripped me when the bank rejected our final loan application. And then I saw Nadine. I remembered the quiet, courageous smile on her face as she came into the kitchen carrying a small velvet box. Inside was her diamond wedding ring, the only possession she owned that held any real worth. She set it gently in my hand and told me to sell it. She said that Colton's future mattered far more than any piece of jewelry ever could. We sold that ring to cover his elite private school tuition, making certain he would never have to sit at the failing public schools of our neighborhood. We gave up our own contentment, our own financial stability, to lay a golden road beneath his feet. Everything we surrendered for him. I reached out and wrapped my hand around the warm porcelain coffee cup. My hand was not trembling from age. It was shaking with a depth of fury I had never once known in all my years. The ultimate betrayal had burned through my chest, like a brand incinerating every last remnant of paternal grace I still possessed. There he sat at that center table, unhurried, at perfect ease, bringing another expensive cut of meat to his lips, chewing slowly, with his eyes closed, as though savoring some profound culinary discovery. The sheer confidence of his relaxed posture drove the blood pounding hard into my temples. Instead of crossing the floor and reducing myself to a spectacle, I stayed precisely where I was. I needed to understand the full dimensions of the game my own son was running before I made a single move. I raised my hand and signaled the maitre d' to stop where he stood. I drew back into the deeper shadow of the corridor and motioned for him to follow. When he was close enough, I leaned in and spoke quietly and steadily. "I do not want them to know I am here," I said. "Put me in the high-backed corner booth directly behind them, the one facing the wall." He gave a silent nod and led me around the perimeter of the dining room. We moved like ghosts through the dim light, staying clear of the main pathways until we reached the large, semicircular leather booth set directly behind Colton. The back of the booth was high enough to conceal my presence entirely from anyone at the center table. I slid into the soft leather seat facing the dark oak paneling of the wall. I ordered a black coffee. I sat perfectly still in the shadows. My booth was near enough to theirs that I could catch the faint clinking of their silverware against the porcelain. Their voices carried over the leather partition with a sickening precision. The waiter came back to refill their wine glasses. I heard the sound of the pour, followed by Cordelia releasing another long, satisfied exhale. "This Bordeaux is absolutely divine, Colton," she said, her voice wrapped in the same artificial refinement as before. "It is certainly a step up from the swill your father serves at those dreary holiday dinners. You really must tell him to upgrade his wine cellar." Colton laughed, the same light, easy sound. "I will be sure to pass along your critique, Cordelia, though I doubt he could appreciate the finer points of a vintage like this. He is a meat and potatoes kind of man." The disrespect sat heavy in her, but it was nothing next to what landed after it. "Well, he will not have to worry about his wine cellars for much longer, will he?" Cordelia's tone sharpened again, all amusement gone. "Tell me, Colton, how much longer until the old fossil signs I am growing terribly impatient." My heart had stopped the first time I heard those words. Hearing them again, repeated with such casual certainty, made something in me go permanently cold. I had never once discussed signing away my legal rights or my financial independence. I had handed over the chief executive role, nothing more. Full ownership of my assets and my estate remained mine. I have already engaged those interior designers from New York for his suburban mansion. Cordelia continued, her voice bright with anticipation. We are going to gut the main floor entirely. The dark paneling has to come out. It is completely oppressive. It is going to be expensive, but it will finally be fit for my guests. My hands had closed again into fists. My nails were biting into my palms. Cordelia was talking about my home, the house I built with Nadine, the house where our son had grown up. Colton said nothing to defend it. He said nothing to defend what we had built. He simply smiled and reached for his wine. Relax, Cordelia, my son said, his voice as smooth and untroubled as still water. The old man's mind is going anyway. The old man's mind is slipping anyway. He is getting forgetful, confused. I have the documents ready to go. One signature on Friday, and we will toss him into Glenbrook memory care by Monday. He will not even realize what hit him until he is eating pureed peas in a wheelchair. Glenbrook memory care. A bleak, cheerless facility on the outskirts of the city, known for its hollow atmosphere and bare minimum care. My own son was scheming to confine me to a sterile room simply to seize immediate control of my estate. A sharp physical pain knifed through my chest, burning like a live coal against my ribs. My blood turned to absolute ice. The waiter returned to my booth in silence and set a steaming cup of black coffee on the table before me. I did not so much as glance at him. My eyes were locked on the wooden paneling, but what they saw was the past. I saw my beautiful Nadine. I remembered the quiet, courageous smile on her face as she walked into the kitchen, carrying a small velvet box. Inside was her diamond wedding ring, the only possession she owned of any real worth. She pressed it into my hand and told me to sell it. We sold that ring to cover his elite private school tuition, ensuring he would never be sent to the failing public schools in our neighborhood. We gave up our own happiness, our own financial footing, to pave a golden road for him to walk on. The ultimate betrayal burned through my soul, reducing every ounce of paternal instinct I had left to ash. The plates were finally cleared away. The laughter at the table settled into a low, contented murmur. Colton raised his hand and snapped his fingers lightly to summon the waiter. The waiter stepped over promptly, presenting a sleek black leather billfold. I did not need to see the printed total to know the precise damage. Between the imported caviar, the custom Wagyu steaks, and the $4,000 bottle of vintage Bordeaux, the bill sat comfortably around $6,500. Colton did not trouble himself to open the folder and check the amount. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his velvet blazer and drew out a heavy metallic card. The black corporate card. My corporate card. He flipped it casually onto the silver tray without a second glance. This was the moment of truth. I set my coffee cup on its saucer. I eased slowly out of the high-backed corner booth and got to my feet. I smoothed the lapels of my suit, squared my shoulders, and drew one long, steadying breath. Then I stepped out from the shadow of the mahogany pillar and walked with measured purpose toward the center of the dining room. Colton happened to glance up, looking past Renata's shoulder, and his eyes locked directly onto mine. The color drained violently from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He went completely rigid in his chair. Renata turned her head. The moment she saw me, her perfectly manicured hand flew to cover her mouth in a silent gasp. Cordelia blinked, twice her eyes wide and frozen with shock. I reached out and smoothly lifted the heavy black corporate card from the waiter's silver tray. "Dad!" Colton whispered, his voice unraveling. "Dad, I can explain." I looked directly at the restaurant manager, who had quickly materialized at my side. "Cancel this transaction immediately," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I am the primary account holder, and this corporate card is now officially reported stolen." "But Dad," Colton gasped, "you will cover the $6,500 bill from your personal accounts." I said. I offered a cold smile and walked out, leaving the three of them stranded and publicly humiliated at that lavish table. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon, throwing long, pale shadows across the polished hardwood floors of my study. I had not slept a single minute. I spent the entire night in my leather armchair staring at the cold, unlit fireplace, replaying the stunning audacity of my son again and again. The betrayal had settled in my chest, like a heavy freezing anchor displacing the warm, paternal love I had carried for nearly 4 decades. I was only beginning to map out my next move when the sharp, metallic click of the front door rang through the silent mansion and pulled me from my thoughts. Colton still held a key to the estate, a privilege I had extended years ago, and now recognized as a serious error in judgment. Footsteps hammered frantically against the marble foyer, the heavy, desperate sound of a man rushing to save himself. I remained perfectly still in my chair as Colton and Renata burst into the study. They looked thoroughly disheveled, a stark contrast to the polished, arrogant pair I had left humiliated at the restaurant the night before. Colton was breathing hard. His designer tie was loosened, his hair deliberately tousled in a calculated display of distress. Before I could speak a single word, my 38-year-old son lurched forward and dropped heavily to his knees on the Persian rug in front of me. "Dad, please. You have to listen to me." Colton pleaded, his voice fracturing with an emotion so precisely manufactured it almost earned my admiration. "You completely misunderstood what was happening last night. It was not what it looked like. You took it all entirely wrong." I looked down at him, my face giving nothing away. I simply waited, letting the silence swell and deepen, forcing him to scramble through his rehearsed script. Colton swallowed hard and extended his hands toward me, hovering just inches from my knees, trembling faintly as though he were a frightened child begging for absolution. "Hi, the conversation you overheard, the part about the nursing home, that was not about you, Dad. I swear on my life it was not about you. We were talking about Renata's great-uncle Douglas. He is in serious cognitive decline, and her family is desperately trying to decide what to do. Glenbrook was the only facility with an immediate opening. Cordelia was just stressed about the paperwork. We would never ever speak about you that way. You have to believe me." He paused and wiped a single perfectly timed tear from the corner of his eye before delivering his grand finale. "And the dinner, the wine, the steaks." Colton continued, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper of regret. "Dad, we were planning your surprise 70th birthday party. We were going to host a grand gala for you this coming weekend. We only used the corporate card because the event planner required an immediate deposit for the venue, and I had left my personal checkbook at the office by mistake. We wanted it to be the perfect evening for you. We were celebrating your life, your legacy. That is precisely why there was so much laughter. We were trading our favorite memories of you from when we were growing up. When you stepped out of the shadows and canceled the card, we were so paralyzed by the shock of seeing you that we could not get a word of explanation out in time. We felt absolutely terrible." I studied him without expression. His performance was flawless. A younger version of myself, a softer man who ached to keep his family whole, might have reached down, pulled him to his feet, and begged forgiveness for the misunderstanding. But the man in that chair had weathered decades of corporate maneuvering and ruthless boardroom warfare. I knew exactly what a cornered liar looked like. Right on cue, Renata stepped forward, her eyes brimming with freshly summoned tears. She sank to her knees beside Colton, her elegant silk skirt spreading around her on the rug. She reached out and gripped my forearm tightly, her hands trembling. "Oh, Gerald, we are so incredibly sorry," she wept. Her voice pitched to a fragile, quivering vulnerability. "It was a terrible miscommunication. We wanted so desperately to surprise you that we ended up breaking your heart on your own birthday. I have not stopped crying since you walked out of that restaurant. Please, you have to forgive us. We love you so much. You are the patriarch of this family. We could never survive without you." I looked at her manicured fingers wrapped around my sleeve, I felt the complete hollowness behind every word. She was an apex predator wearing the disguise of a wounded bird. They believed they had constructed the perfect alibi. They were certain I was just a lonely, sentimental old man who would seize eagerly at any explanation rather than face the dark truth about his fractured family. They thought me foolish enough to accept that a $4,000 bottle of Bordeaux was standard protocol for booking a party venue, or that Cordelia, a woman who treated her own relatives as disposable assets, harbored any genuine concern for a fictional great-uncle. I let out a long, heavy sigh and allowed my shoulders to sag forward in defeat. I let the sharp, calculating light behind my eyes dim into a soft, misty expression of paternal confusion and overwhelming relief. I lowered my hands and placed them gently over theirs. "Is that true?" I asked, letting my voice waver by just a fraction, a perfect imitation of a man desperate to be comforted. "Colton, is that really what was happening? I thought I had heard you plotting against me. I thought I had lost my only son." Colton nodded immediately, his whole face opening into a bright, relieved smile. "Yes, Dad. I swear it. We love you. We would never betray you." I squeezed his shoulder and offered them both a warm, forgiving smile. "I am so sorry I ruined your dinner," I murmured, playing the apologetic old man to absolute perfection. I suppose my thoughts get away from me at times. A man living alone in a house this size starts to hear things and fear the worst. "Please, both of you, get up. Come sit with me. We can leave all this ugliness behind us." As they rose, brushing their knees and dabbing their eyes, I caught a brief, triumphant look pass between them. They believed they had won. They believed the danger had passed, and the road to my fortune lay open once again. Their performance had been thoroughly convincing, a masterclass in emotional manipulation crafted to disarm a grieving widower. They genuinely believed their crocodile tears had undone the damage of the previous evening. They settled onto the leather sofa across from me, their breathing evening out, as the adrenaline from their little performance began to fade. Renata launched into animated chatter about the fictional surprise party, filling in phantom guest lists and a non-existent catering menu. She beamed radiantly, projecting every inch of the devoted, caring daughter-in-law. I nodded along, offering soft murmurs and appreciative sounds, playing my role with the same commitment they brought to theirs. But as Renata leaned forward to make a point about floral arrangements, the morning light pouring through the study window caught a subtle, unmistakable flash of vivid green near the collar of her blouse. My heart stopped for the breadth of a heartbeat, yet my expression stayed perfectly pleasant. The game had just shifted irrevocably. I forced myself to keep smiling, absorbing her hollow words, while something cold and furious ignited deep in my veins. The elaborate lie they had just delivered was nothing beside the physical evidence now sitting directly in front of me. I had to hold my mask in place. It was a teardrop-cut emerald set within an intricate lattice of vintage platinum and small, brilliant-cut diamonds. Nadine had inherited it from her grandmother. I knew every facet of that stone, every delicate curve of the metalwork, because I had spent countless evenings watching it catch the light against my wife's evening gowns at charity galas and corporate dinners. Nadine cherished that brooch. She wore it like a badge of honor, a fragment of family history that had survived the lean years of our beginning. When she passed, I could not bring myself to look at it. The memories it carried were too sharp, too raw. I wrapped it myself in black velvet and locked it away in my private safe deposit box 438 at the downtown branch of Liberty Federal Bank. It was meant to rest there untouched, a silent monument to the woman I had loved. And yet, here it was, pinned casually to the lapel of Renata's designer blouse, used as nothing more than an accessory to complete her morning look. My mind raced through the sheer impossibility of it. My safe deposit box required 2 keys to open. The bank manager held one. I held the other, secured inside a biometric safe in my master bedroom suite. Beyond that, accessing the vault demanded my physical presence, valid identification, and a verified signature. The protocols were ironclad, designed to shield high-net-worth clients from precisely this kind of theft. The bank manager knew my face, my voice, and my standing instructions about who was permitted near the secure area. There was no margin for error, no room for misinterpretation. For Renata to be wearing that emerald Colton had to have circumvented the bank's most stringent security measures. He had to have gained unauthorized access to my most heavily guarded assets. The horrifying truth crashed over me like a breaking wave. If they had breached the vault, they had not merely taken a piece of jewelry. That box held my bearer bonds, emergency cash reserves, original deeds to several commercial properties, and the master copy of my final will and testament. If they had the key and the clearance to empty it, they had the power to dismantle my entire financial existence. The conversation from the restaurant came rushing back. The power of attorney. They had forged or manipulated their way into total control over my life. I let my gaze drift lazily away from the emerald, keeping my eyes dull and thoroughly unobservant. I could not allow them to see the predator stirring inside me. I nodded through Renata's rambling account of the catering arrangements for my fictional surprise party, offering a gentle, agreeable chuckle at all the right moments. "That sounds absolutely wonderful, my dear," I said, my voice thick with manufactured paternal warmth. "I am so touched you would go to such lengths for an old man." I extended a trembling hand, precisely mimicking the unsteady movements of a man overcome with feeling, and gently patted her arm, leaning in just a fraction closer. The proximity gave me a perfect view of the brooch. There was a tiny, nearly microscopic scratch on the lower left diamond, setting a mark made 30 years ago, when Nadine accidentally caught it against a marble counter. It was unmistakably hers. As my hand passed near her collar, I saw Renata stiffen for a fraction of a second. A fleeting shadow of panic crossed her perfectly mascaraed eyes. She knew exactly what she was wearing, and for one terrifying instant, she feared I would recognize it. But I simply smiled a wide, foolish smile, and drew her into a full embrace. "You are a wonderful daughter-in-law, Renata," I whispered close to her ear. "I am so blessed to have you in this family." She relaxed at once, releasing a long breath of relief. She returned the hug, patting my back with barely concealed condescension. The scent of her expensive French perfume filled my nose, cloying, sickeningly sweet. It took every measure of my willpower not to pull away. Instead, I held the embrace just long enough to cement her false sense of total victory. Then I stepped back and turned to Colton. My son stood there radiating smug, triumphant energy. He truly believed he had outsmarted me completely. He believed he had successfully gaslit a man who had built a corporate empire from nothing. I opened my arms. Colton stepped forward and wrapped his around me. I squeezed his shoulders, feeling the tension drain entirely from his frame. "I love you, son," I said, allowing a single strategic tear to form. "I am so proud of the man you have become. I am sorry I doubted you even for a moment." "I love you too, Dad," Colton replied, his voice brimming with arrogant ease. "We just want to take care of you. You don't need to worry about a single thing anymore. We have everything completely under control." I nodded, pressing a handkerchief to my eye. I walked them to the grand foyer, leaning with practiced care on the mahogany banister. I stood in the open doorway and waved like a grateful, weary old man as they descended the stone steps toward their luxury sedan. I watched Colton open the passenger door for Renata. I watched her settle into the leather seat, the morning sun catching that emerald brooch one final time. I watched them roll down the long, winding driveway, their taillights swallowed beyond the wrought iron gates of my estate. The moment they were fully out of sight, something in me changed. The stoop left my shoulders instantly. The trembling in my hands ceased entirely. The vague, misty look in my eyes sharpened into something cold and obsidian hard. I closed the heavy oak door and turned the deadbolt. The silence of the mansion settled around me once again, but this time it was not the silence of a lonely widower. It was the silence of a war room. They thought they had pulled off a bloodless coup. They thought I was a fragile relic waiting quietly for a bed at Glenbrook Memory Care. But by wearing Nadine's brooch, Renata had done more than insult my wife's memory. She had exposed the full terrifying reach of their infiltration. If they had access to my vault, they had access to my entire life. The time for sorrow had passed. The season of grief was finished. I walked briskly toward my private study, my mind operating with a lethal surgical precision I had not called upon in over a decade. I lifted the phone from my desk. I did not call my son. I did not call the police. I dialed the direct unlisted number of Edmond Lacroix. My corporate attorney was a man who understood the mechanics of destruction better than anyone alive. As the line rang, I gazed out at the city I had conquered. My son wanted to play a game of deception and theft. He wanted to strip away my legacy and lock me inside some sterile facility. He had fatally underestimated the foundation of the empire he was trying to steal. The war had officially begun, and I was going to burn their entire world to the ground. I set the phone down after speaking with Edmond Lacroix, the dial tone ringing in my ears like a starting bell. There was no time to spare. I bypassed my regular driver, snatching the keys to my black sedan from the mahogany table in the foyer. The drive from my estate to the downtown financial district passed in a blur of gray concrete and streaking traffic lights. My hands held the leather steering wheel with a terrifying stillness. The initial shock of seeing Nadine's emerald brooch had fully dissolved, leaving behind nothing but cold, clinical resolve. I moved through the heavy morning traffic with the focused precision of a man who has just grasped the exact dimensions of the battlefield. I pulled up to the imposing marble facade of Liberty Federal Bank and handed my keys to the valet without a word. The heavy brass doors swung inward, drawing me into the hushed, cavernous lobby. I had been a premium client at this branch for nearly 40 years. I knew the tellers. I knew the security staff. I knew every corner of the private wealth management sector. I walked past the main reception desk and headed straight for the frosted glass doors of the executive wing. My destination was Mr. Bellamy, the senior branch manager, a man who had personally overseen my accounts for the better part of a decade. I pushed open the heavy glass door to his private suite without the courtesy of a knock. Mr. Bellamy was seated at his broad desk, working through a stack of paper documents. He glanced up, a polished, professional smile forming out of instinct. Then it evaporated the instant he registered my face. He did not look like a man greeting one of his most valuable clients. He looked like a man who had just been caught. The color left his cheeks in an instant, and his hands jerked visibly over his paperwork. "Mr. Whitfield," he stammered, pushing his leather chair back so hard it struck the credenza behind him. "This is quite a surprise. We weren't expecting you today." I stepped inside and pulled the door firmly shut behind me. The solid click of the latch rang out in the still office. "I don't need an appointment to access my own property, Bellamy," I said, my voice dangerously quiet and even. "I want immediate access to my private safe deposit box. Now." Mr. Bellamy swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for a way out. He rose from his chair, straightening his silk tie. "Mr. Whitfield, please sit down. Let me have some water brought in. There are some matters regarding your account we need to go over." I did not move an inch. I folded my arms and held his gaze without blinking. "I don't want water and I don't want a chair. I want to see my vault." Mr. Bellamy pressed a hand to his brow, wiping away a film of perspiration. His professional composure was fracturing visibly under the weight of my stare. "Sir, I'm not certain why you've come in today. Your son Colton specifically informed us you were resting at the estate under medical supervision." Medical supervision. I repeated, letting those two words hang in the air between us like a blade. "Choose your next words with great care, Bellamy." The manager's hands were shaking now in earnest. He reached across his desk and drew a thick manila folder from a locked drawer. "2 weeks ago, Colton came into the branch. He began, his voice dropping to a strained whisper. He presented a fully notarized emergency temporary power of attorney. He brought a signed affidavit from a private physician stating that you were experiencing a rapid, severe cognitive decline. He told us your memory was deteriorating, that you were suffering from paranoid delusions, and that you were no longer capable of safely managing your own financial affairs. I stood there absorbing the horrifying mechanics of my own son's scheme. Colton had not simply lied. He had meticulously constructed an entire legal and medical narrative to have me declared incompetent. He had turned my age into a weapon. And you simply surrendered the keys to my entire life on the strength of a document. I asked, the quiet fury in my voice making Mr. Bellamy flinch. It was an airtight legal instrument, Mr. Whitfield, signed by a Supreme Court notary and supported by medical professionals. Colton is your only son and your named beneficiary. He said he needed to secure your physical assets to cover the cost of your specialized in-home care. Our legal department reviewed everything and authorized the bypass. We had no grounds to suspect anything improper. He invoked the emergency clause. He told us he needed to clear the safe deposit box immediately to prevent you from inadvertently liquidating your own assets in a confused state. My blood went entirely cold. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I simply turned and walked out of his office, moving directly toward the secure elevator that descended to the subterranean vault. I heard Mr. Bellamy scrambling after me, his dress shoes skidding on the polished marble as he hurried to catch up. He poured out nervous apologies and legal justifications the entire way, but I had already tuned him out. We rode down into the quiet, climate-controlled depths of the building. The massive steel gates of the vault came into view. The guard on duty looked uncertain, but stepped aside quickly as Mr. Bellamy swiped his master key card and entered his biometric code. The great gears engaged, and the thick metal door groaned open. We walked the silent corridor of gleaming steel boxes until we reached mine. Number 438. I drew my brass key from my coat pocket and seated it in the right side lock. Mr. Bellamy, his hand still unsteady, fitted his master key into the left. We turned them together. The internal mechanism released with a click. I reached forward and drew the long, heavy metal drawer free from the wall. I carried it to the private viewing table beneath the stark fluorescent lights. I lifted the hinged lid. The box was completely empty. A vast, hollow void stared back at me. My cash reserves gone. 30 years' worth of unregistered bearer bonds accumulated through decades of business gone. The original unencumbered deeds to my commercial properties in the financial district vanished. And most devastating of all, Nadine's jewelry collection, entirely gone. The heavy gold necklaces, the diamond bracelets, the antique pearl earrings she wore on our anniversaries. My son had methodically stripped away every physical remnant of my life's work and my wife's memory. He had moved through that vault like a vulture stripping a carcass to the bone. He had stolen the tangible history of my marriage. I reached into the bare metal drawer and ran my fingertips along the cold, empty bottom. There was a single faint impression in the felt lining where Nadine's emerald brooch had rested. The full weight of the devastation was staggering, and yet my mind had never felt sharper. Colton had used a fabricated power of attorney to drain my hidden assets, clean securing his own financial survival while leaving me stripped and defenseless. He had taken everything. I did not linger in the underground chill of the vault. The season for mourning stolen heirlooms had closed, replaced by a single burning directive. I left the empty metal drawer sitting on the viewing table, a hollow monument to my son's breathtaking greed, and walked out of Liberty Federal Bank without sparing Mr. Bellamy another glance. The sunlight outside felt harsh and entirely detached from the dark truth I had just uncovered. I settled back into my sedan and gripped the wheel, mapping the precise coordinates of my retaliation. Colton had made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed that because I was his father, I would respond as a wounded patriarch. He had forgotten that long before I was a father, I was a builder of corporate empires, a man who had dismantled rival companies with surgical efficiency. I pulled into the flow of downtown traffic, heading directly toward the towering glass structure that housed the law firm of Lacroix, Alderton, and Keene. I was not coming to retain a soft, conciliatory family attorney to negotiate some domestic settlement. I was summoning the wolf. Edmond Lacroix was a man built entirely of sharp angles and predatory instincts. He was a corporate litigator who made his name in hostile takeovers and aggressive asset recovery. His office was a reflection of his ruthlessness. Dark, heavily polished mahogany paneling, low ambient lighting, and a sweeping wall of windows commanding the city skyline. He never asked about your weekend, and he never offered hollow reassurances. He dealt only in leverage, brutal efficiency, and total victory. I moved past his startled executive assistant and pushed open the heavy double doors of his private suite without knocking. Edmund was behind his massive desk speaking into a headset. The moment he read my expression, he cut the call dead. He set down his glasses, his sharp, calculating eyes reading my posture in an instant. I did not take a seat. I crossed to the center of the room and laid both palms flat on the cool leather surface of his desk. Colton has initiated a hostile takeover of my personal estate, I said, my voice unnervingly calm. He forged a medical affidavit, secured a fraudulent power of attorney, and emptied my primary safe deposit box. My bearer bonds, my property deeds, and Nadine's jewelry are completely gone. Edmund did not gasp or reach for empty words of comfort. His mind shifted immediately into the mechanics of legal warfare. He pressed his fingertips together and leaned forward. Before I tell you what I uncovered in that meeting and what it revealed about just how far the people closest to me were willing to go, let me ask you this. If you discovered someone you loved and trusted had been quietly working against you, would you confront them immediately, or would you say nothing and build your case in silence? How did he bypass the biometric protocols at Liberty Federal Bank? Edmund asked, his tone entirely clinical. He invoked an emergency medical clause claiming rapid cognitive decline and paranoid delusions, I replied. He convinced the branch manager that I posed an immediate danger to my own financial well-being. He is currently moving through this city funding a lavish lifestyle on my corporate cards and planning to have me committed to Glenbrook Memory Care by Monday morning. Edmund absorbed every word, a dangerous, calculating smirk spreading slowly across his face. It was the look of a predator who has just caught the scent of blood in open water. Your son is exceptionally bold, Edmund observed quietly. But he has made a catastrophic procedural error. By drawing on the corporate infrastructure to bankroll his personal charade, he has thrown open the door to a full corporate inquiry. What are your specific instructions? I crossed to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the crawling traffic far below. I want him trapped, I said, turning back to face my attorney. I do not want him warned. I do not want him tipped off in any way. If he senses that I know the truth, he will move to liquidate the stolen bearer bonds and push the cash into untraceable offshore accounts. He will panic and torch the remaining assets to save himself. I need a covert forensic audit of the entire company, top tier and completely invisible to his network. Edmund rose from his chair and began to pace the length of the thick Persian rug. Colton is currently the acting chief executive officer, he mused. He controls the daily operational flow. We cannot use the standard internal auditing firm. They report directly to his office. We need to go around the entire internal structure. I will bring in a ghost team from an independent forensic accounting agency out of New York. They will work remotely, mirroring the company servers overnight. We will track every transaction, every redirected corporate fund, every shadow account he has opened since assuming leadership. We will have his entire web of deceit mapped before he even opens his eyes tomorrow morning. But tracing the theft is only the first phase. I continued, my voice hardening. I want to cut off his financial oxygen immediately, but so quietly that he doesn't realize he's suffocating until he actually reaches for air. Edmund stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing in understanding. You want to silently freeze the shadow accounts, he concluded. Exactly, I confirmed. Colton believes he has unrestricted access to the corporate treasury. He is staging a fictional surprise party this weekend, no doubt planning to drain the company accounts to impress Renata and her insufferable mother. I want you to identify every secondary corporate card, every off-the-books expense account, and every unauthorized credit line he has opened. Freeze them all simultaneously. Do not flag them as fraudulent yet. Place a quiet administrative hold on the transactions. Let the bank systems return a vague processing error when he tries to swipe the cards. I want him standing at a register, attempting to buy luxury goods with stolen money, only to feel the humiliating sting of a declined transaction. I want him to experience the creeping dread of losing his grip. Edmund let out a low, rasping chuckle that carried through the quiet, wood-paneled room. It's a brilliant approach, Gerald. We trap the rat inside the maze. He will assume it's a temporary banking glitch. He will scramble to access other cards, moving funds between his hidden accounts and leaving an enormous, glaring digital trail for our forensic team to follow. The harder he fights to reach the money, the tighter the noose draws around his own neck. He will end up tying himself directly to the embezzlement. Precisely, I agreed. By the time Monday morning arrives, the power of attorney he forged will be legally contested. The stolen bonds will be flagged on an international level, and he will be buried under a mountain of unsecured personal debt. He believes he has engineered the perfect crime, Edmund. Let him go on believing it. Let him walk into this weekend feeling like a king. Let Renata parade through the city wearing my dead wife's emerald brooch. I want their confidence to reach its absolute peak before we move. I want them to feel completely untouchable right up until the very last moment. Because the higher they climb, the more devastating the impact when I finally pull the ground from beneath them. It will be a flawless and devastating execution. 3 agonizing days passed in a state of suspended animation. I remained within the walls of my estate, sealed off entirely from the outside world. I ignored the frantic voicemails from Colton, who was desperately trying to account for why his corporate cards were being declined at luxury boutiques across the city. I played the resting confused elder to absolute perfection, instructing my security staff to turn away all visitors. I needed the silence. I needed the isolation to allow Edmund and his ghost team of forensic accountants to conduct their surgical excavation of my company. On the 3rd evening, as the sun dropped below the horizon and threw long shadows across my mahogany desk, the heavy oak doors of my study swung open. Edmund stepped into the room. He did not carry the look of a man bearing good news. He held a thick leather briefcase, his expression tighter and more severe than I had ever seen it wear. He set the briefcase down on my desk with a heavy thud, the sound fracturing the absolute stillness of the room. He offered no greeting. He simply released the latch and drew out a stack of financial reports bound in heavy red folders. We found the breach. Edmund said, his voice stripped of all professional courtesy and replaced by a grim, razor-sharp clarity. And it is a catastrophic hemorrhage. I leaned forward in my leather chair, my eyes locking onto the dense columns of figures and highlighted transactions. Tell me exactly what my son has done. I commanded, my voice unnervingly steady. Edmund spread the documents across the polished surface, gesturing to a series of interconnected flowcharts. Colton has not been running your logistics empire for the past 8 months. He has been systematically bleeding it dry. The moment you placed him in the chief executive's chair, he established a sophisticated embezzlement operation. He built a network of 7 phantom vendor companies' entities, carrying legitimate-sounding names like Apex Global Supply and Horizon Freight Solutions, complete with fabricated tax identification numbers and forged service contracts. I stared at the pages, my mind working through the sheer scale of the theft. He used these shell corporations to bill your firm for logistical services that were never rendered. Edmund continued, his finger tracing a thick red line across the page. He authorized the payments, personally overriding the standard accounting protocols by invoking executive privilege. Over the course of exactly 8 months, Colton siphoned exactly 4.5 million out of your corporate treasury. The figure hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. 4.5 million, a staggering sum money that represented decades of sacrifice, of missed holidays, of relentless negotiation. I lifted one of the ledger sheets and traced the routing numbers with a steady finger. "Where did the money go, Edmund?" I asked, refusing to allow my voice to waver. Colton lives well beyond his means, I know that. But he cannot spend $4.5 million on custom velvet blazers and Wagyu beef. He is hiding it. Where does the chain end? Edmund drew a secondary file from his briefcase and placed it squarely in front of me. The capital did not remain in the United States, Gerald. The phantom vendors immediately wired it through a series of layered accounts in the Cayman Islands to obscure the origin, but my team cracked the final destination. Every single dollar was funneled into VIP offshore accounts located in Macau. Macau, the glittering global capital of high-stakes gambling. I settled back into my chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me, my mind sifting rapidly through the pieces. Colton was not a gambler. He was reckless and arrogant with credit, but he lacked the stomach for casino tables. Renata chased luxury, but she was consumed by tangible status symbols, not the volatile rush of baccarat. Then, like a bolt of lightning splitting open a pitch-black sky, the realization struck. I was back in that restaurant. I saw Cordelia lifting her glass of $4,000 in Bordeaux. I recalled the heavy fake pearl necklace she wore to project an image of generational wealth she had never actually possessed. I remembered the frantic, naked greed in her voice as she pressed Colton on how much longer it would take to secure my power of attorney. I recalled the whispers Nadine used to bring home from the society wives, rumors about Cordelia and her late husband, talk of hidden debts, ruined estates, and a dark, consuming addiction that had been quietly hollowing out her family long before Renata ever married my son. "It's Cordelia." I whispered, the terrible truth locking into place. Edmund looked back at me with silent confirmation in his sharp eyes. "She is not a society matriarch. She is a degenerate gambling addict." The pieces interlocked with a sickening, flawless precision. Cordelia had not merely squandered her late husband's fortune. She had chased her addiction all the way to the most dangerous tables on earth. She had leveraged herself into a hole so deep that conventional lenders would no longer go near her. She had turned to the shadow economy, taking massive unsecured loans from the kind of people who collect their debts in ways that have nothing to do with letters. She owed millions to the triads in Macau, and when those ruthless syndicates finally came for their money, Cordelia turned to her daughter. Renata, terrified of losing both her mother and her fabricated social standing, turned to Colton. He was weak, pliable, desperate to satisfy his demanding wife and hold his manufactured world together. So he chose to betray his own blood. He chose to ransack the empire I had built to cover the gambling debts of a parasitic woman who saw me as nothing more than a walking treasury. He was not stealing to secure his own future. He was frantically shoveling my life's work into a blazing furnace simply to keep the wolves from Cordelia's door. The urgency surrounding the power of attorney suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. $4.5 million had clearly failed to appease the syndicates. The debt was still climbing. They needed immediate access to my entire estate. They needed my commercial properties, my bearer bonds, my personal vault, everything to save themselves from the violent consequences of Cordelia's addiction. They were perfectly prepared to lock me away in a miserable care facility to ensure their own survival. I looked across at Edmund, the last remnants of my paternal grief burning away entirely, leaving nothing behind but cold, indestructible resolve. "The trap is set," Edmund said quietly. "His shadow accounts are frozen. The offshore wire transfers have been flagged. By tomorrow morning, the syndicates will realize the flow of money has stopped. Colton will have absolutely nowhere to turn." I slowly closed the red audit folder and pressed both palms flat against the thick cardboard cover. The financial bleeding ends tonight, I stated, my voice carrying a note of finality through the dim study. Prepare the legal strike. We are going to obliterate them without mercy. Edmund did not reach for the clasp of his briefcase. Instead, he reached into the rear compartment and withdrew a single black folder. His movements had slowed the clinical detachment he had carried while exposing the Macau embezzlement, now replaced by something heavier. He set the black folder at the center of my desk, his hand resting on the cover a moment longer than necessary. I believed the financial hemorrhage represented the absolute floor of this betrayal. Edmund said, his voice dropping to a grave register. I was wrong. The theft was merely the symptom. This folder contains the actual disease. I stared in silence at the plain black cover. The staggering theft of $4.5 million had already shattered my understanding of my only son beyond repair. What could possibly be worse than robbing your own father to pay off a violent gambling syndicate? Open it, Edmund said, calm and firm. I turned back the heavy black cover and braced myself. Inside lay a stack of printed digital correspondence. The headers identified them as emails, but the formatting looked raw, as though pulled directly off a server. My forensic team did not limit themselves to the active accounting software, Edmund explained. They ran a deep recovery protocol across Colton's deleted private servers. He believed he had scrubbed his digital footprint clean, but he used basic wiping software that my technicians bypassed within an hour. What they recovered was a heavily encrypted email chain between Colton and a man named Dr. Cresswell. The name stirred something at the edge of memory, a vague association with corporate charity dinners. Dr. Cresswell was a prominent neurologist at the most exclusive private clinic in the city. He served almost exclusively the ultra-wealthy, a man universally regarded for his iron discretion and his astronomical billing rates. I looked down at the highlighted text on the first page. It was a wire transfer confirmation. Colton had authorized a direct, untraceable payment of $200,000 to an offshore account held entirely by Dr. Cresswell. Why is my son secretly paying a private neurologist $200,000? I asked, my tired eyes moving across the dense medical language. Because Colton needed more than cash to settle Cordelia's casino debts, Edmund replied. The triads are demanding the full outstanding balance. Colton realized that siphoning a few million through phantom companies was far too slow. He needed immediate unrestricted access to your entire 800 million empire, and to obtain that, he needed you legally removed from the picture. I turned the page and the air inside my study seemed to disappear. It was a comprehensive medical evaluation bearing my name, my date of birth, and my social security number. It carried the signature and stamp of Dr. Cresswell. The diagnosis was printed in bold, unambiguous letters. Stage 2, dementia. The document laid out a fabricated history of severe cognitive decline, citing invented episodes of paranoia, memory loss, and an inability to manage complex financial decisions. It declared that I posed a danger to myself and required immediate institutional care. The sheer calculated evil of it blurred my vision. Colton had not merely forged my signature on a few vendor contracts. He had bribed a corrupt society physician to legally erase my competence. He was manufacturing a medical fiction to strip me of my fundamental rights. The conversation at the restaurant played back in my mind with terrifying precision. He had told Cordelia with easy confidence that one signature on Friday would have me inside Glenbrook Memory Care by Monday. He had purchased my institutionalization for $202,000. The medical evaluation is the legal trigger, Edmund explained, directing my attention to a specific paragraph near the end of the document. 3 years ago, when you restructured the company to give Colton the chief executive title, you were determined to protect the business from hostile external takeovers. We drafted the corporate bylaws with extreme precision. You remember the emergency incapacitation clause? I closed my eyes and the memory of that boardroom meeting came rushing back. I had insisted on the clause to safeguard my life's work in the event of a catastrophic health crisis. If I were to fall into a coma or suffer a severe stroke, the clause dictated that the acting chief executive would assume total uncontested control of all voting shares and corporate assets, bypassing the standard board approval process entirely. It was designed to keep the company stable in a genuine emergency. I had built the ultimate defensive shield, and my son had turned it into a weapon pointed directly at me. Colton has weaponized your own protective measures, Edmund confirmed. The emergency incapacitation clause requires a sworn affidavit from a board-certified neurologist confirming that the primary shareholder is permanently unfit to govern. Dr. Cresswell provided that affidavit. Colton now holds the single remaining key to unlock the entire empire. He no longer requires your consent. He no longer needs a single signature from you. The power of attorney he filed at the bank was only a temporary measure to free up immediate cash. The ultimate objective is the full activation of the incapacitation clause. And the timeline? I asked, my voice drained of all emotion. When does he drop the guillotine? Edmund tapped the final page of the dossier. The corporate bylaws require that the board of directors be given 48 hours notice before the incapacitation clause is fully executed. Colton dispatched the sealed medical documents to the board secretary this morning. The mandatory waiting period expires this coming Friday. By Friday afternoon, he will stand as the sole undisputed master of your $800 million estate. You will be legally classified as a ward of the state, and your forced transfer to Glenbrook Memory Care will be entirely lawful. I rose from my desk, leaving the black folder open beneath the harsh glow of my reading lamp. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that it incinerated whatever traces of sorrow still remained inside me. The man who had wept over a stolen emerald brooch no longer existed. He had been replaced entirely by something cold and mechanical. My son had spent months building an intricate, invisible cage around me, methodically securing every door and sealing every exit. He had bribed physicians, forged contracts, and plundered my private vault, all while meeting my eyes with a smile. But Colton had committed one fundamental error in his grand design. He had assumed the game was already finished. He had assumed I would simply accept my fate without ever examining the board. "We are not going to wait for Friday, Edmund," I said, turning to face my attorney. "We are going to strike at the precise moment he feels most powerful and most secure. Begin the countermeasures immediately. Draft the termination papers, freeze the primary holding accounts, and contact the medical licensing board regarding Dr. Cresswell. I want the authorities waiting silently in the shadows when we finally spring the trap and bring this to an end." Colton wanted a real war. He had badly miscalculated. He was about to discover exactly why I built this empire in the first place. I left Edmund's office and made the drive back to the estate in suffocating silence. My focus remained entirely locked on the intricate mechanics of the trap I was about to spring. For decades, I had wielded authority to command boardrooms. Now I had to do the precise opposite. I had to become a frail, diminished old man, utterly dependent on a son who possessed not a shred of mercy. I rolled through the iron gates of my estate, parked, and sat motionless behind the steering wheel, rehearsing my physical transformation. I forced my spine to curve forward, letting my proud shoulders collapse into a permanent stoop. I loosened the muscles of my face, allowing my jaw to go slightly slack and my sharp gaze to dissolve into a vacant, drifting stare. I cultivated a faint tremor in my left hand. By the time I stepped out of the car, the ruthless corporate architect was entirely gone. In his place stood a confused, vulnerable old man. The performance began in earnest the following morning. Colton and Renata appeared without warning, wearing masks of manufactured concern. They claimed they had come to check on me. I knew their real purpose. They were there to gather fabricated proof of my cognitive decline, raw material, to support the fraudulent medical documents already delivered to the corporate board. I met them at the door in an old fraying cardigan pulled over my pajamas. My hair was deliberately uncombed, and I dragged my slippered feet across the marble foyer. "Hello, you two," I said. letting my voice waver, the familiar baritone thinned to a frail, reedy whisper. How good of you to visit an old man. I am a little turned around this morning. The days have been blurring together lately. Colton immediately shot a swift, triumphant look at his wife. The raw, predatory delight that flashed across his face was nearly unbearable to observe. He moved forward and dropped a heavy, patronizing hand onto my stooped shoulder. "That is perfectly all right, Dad," Colton said, his tone thick with sickening condescension. "You have been carrying a great deal of pressure. We are just here to make certain you are comfortable and safe. From now on, you simply relax and let us handle everything." I nodded slowly, my eyes drifting past him toward the grand staircase, as though I had lost my thread entirely. I reached out and patted his hand with trembling fingers. "Thank you, buddy," I murmured, gazing up at him with wide, bewildered eyes. Colton went completely still. The air in the grand foyer seemed to vanish. Renata drew a sharp breath, her designer handbag slipping slightly from her grip. Buddy was a childhood nickname, a throwaway name I had used when Colton was a toddler, fixated on a stray dog. I had not spoken it in over 30 years. He had despised it, even as a teenager. "Dad," Colton said, his voice carefully controlled as he studied my face. "It is me. It is Colton. Why did you just call me Buddy?" I blinked several times, feigning a sudden deep disorientation. I looked down at my hands, then back up at his face, my expression collapsing into a portrait of helplessness. "Colton. Of course it is Colton." I stammered, my voice shaking badly. "I do not know why I said that. I was just thinking about that summer at the lake house. The summer you landed that enormous trout. You remember, do you not? You were only 7 years old. Your mother was so incredibly proud of you. The lake house had been sold 25 years ago." My son stared at me, his eyes wide, barely containing his exhilaration. He genuinely believed he was watching the real-time deterioration of my mind. He believed the fraudulent medical diagnosis he had bought for $200,000 was manifesting right before his eyes. "Of course I remember, Dad," Colton said smoothly, his posture easing completely. "Do not worry about it. It is perfectly natural to get nostalgic. Why don't we go into the kitchen? Renata and I can put on a warm cup of tea for you." I let them guide me down the hallway, shuffling my slippered feet over the hardwood. Renata took my right elbow with an exaggerated delicacy that made my skin crawl. When we entered the vast, gleaming kitchen, I gently pulled free of her grip and shuffled toward the commercial gas range. "Let me do it," I insisted, my voice stubbornly fragile. I can still make tea for my own son and his lovely wife. I am not completely useless yet." I lifted the heavy stainless steel kettle from its hook. I did not fill it with water. I simply placed the completely empty kettle onto the front right burner. I reached for the heavy knob controlling the gas flow and turned it deliberately, listening to the sharp, unmistakable hiss of natural gas flooding into the room. I intentionally skipped the ignition, leaving the raw gas pouring freely from the open burner. Then I turned my back on the stove and wandered to the kitchen island, leaving the empty kettle sitting directly above the unlit gas line. "So, Buddy," I began, smiling absently at the marble countertop. "What time is your mother coming home from the grocery store? She promised to bring those little lemon cookies I am so fond of." The sharp scent of gas began to saturate the kitchen. Renata let out a genuine, piercing shriek of panic. She dropped her pastry basket and lunged across the kitchen, wrenching the burner knob to the off position. She seized the empty kettle, her chest heaving as she spun to face me. Gerald, what are you doing?" Renata cried, her carefully assembled facade cracking under the weight of real fear. "You left the gas running without lighting the flame, and the kettle is bone dry. You could have killed every one of us." I recoiled dramatically, stumbling a half-step backward, as though her raised voice had physically struck me. I stared at the stove in bewildered horror, then at Colton, my lower lip trembling pathetically. "I am so sorry," I whispered. raising my shaking hands to cover my face. I do not know what I was thinking. I was certain I had lit it. I just wanted to make tea for Nadine when she gets home. I am so sorry. I am just so terribly confused today. Colton crossed the room and wrapped an arm around his shaken wife. He did not come to me. He did not ask whether I was all right. Instead, he looked at Renata, and a slow, dark, predatory smile spread across his face, the smile of a man who realizes he has nothing left to fear. "It is all right," Colton said, his voice loud and unhurried, making no effort to mask his cold satisfaction. "He cannot help it. The poor old man has completely lost his mind. Dr. Cresswell was right. He is a serious danger to himself. We will need to move up the transfer timeline. He will not make it through the weekend without burning this entire house to the ground." They stood directly in front of me, openly discussing my institutionalization and the seizure of my estate, entirely certain that my ruined mind could not absorb a single word they exchanged. Their guard had dropped completely. The wolves were lounging at ease inside the house, fully satisfied the shepherd was blind, deaf, and finished. I kept my face buried in my trembling hands, projecting every inch of a broken, senile old man weeping in his kitchen. But behind my fingers, in the private darkness of my own mind, I was not crying. I was smiling. The trap was perfectly baited. They had taken it without hesitation. They were completely unprepared for the devastation bearing down on them. The weekend arrived and transformed my home with swift, brutal efficiency. The kitchen incident had dissolved the last traces of caution in my son and his wife. In their calculations, I was already a ward of the state, a hollow shell waiting to be moved to a sterile room. They no longer spoke in careful whispers around me. They paraded their victory through my hallways with absolute impunity. Watching the shift in their behavior was sickening, but it served my purposes precisely. The trap was armed. By Saturday morning, the invasion had formally commenced. I was settled into my leather armchair by the window, pretending to gaze vacantly at the rain, when the heavy rumble of a moving truck shuddered through the floorboards. I shuffled out into the grand foyer, leaning with practiced weight on the polished mahogany banister. I watched a crew of broad-shouldered men haul an endless procession of grotesque furniture through my doors. They dragged hideous gold-painted sideboards, velvet chaises reeking of mothballs, and gaudy ceramic lamps that belonged at a cheap carnival. It was a chaotic parade of wretched taste, crashing violently against the refined elegance Nadine and I had built over 4 decades. Trailing directly behind the movers came Cordelia, radiating a toxic, triumphant energy. She swept into my foyer in an ostentatious fur coat, jabbing a manicured finger at the sweating men and bellowing orders. "Put that dreadful mirror against the far wall," she shrieked, her voice bouncing harshly off the high ceilings. "And take those drab landscape paintings down. I want my portraits up in their place." I stood at the head of the grand staircase, both hands gripping the railing to keep myself upright. Cordelia had not asked. She had not even bothered with the pretense of courtesy. Emboldened by my manufactured dementia, she was simply planting her flag, dragging her tasteless belongings into my home as though I were already in the ground. Renata came out of the formal dining room with a clipboard ticking off items as the movers hauled them through the door. Colton drifted along behind her, coffee in hand, nodding his approval at the spectacle of disorder. They were turning my home into their personal command post, the nerve center from which they intended to liquidate everything I had built in order to cover Cordelia's staggering syndicate debts. I let out a soft, pitiful wheeze, just loud enough to announce my frail presence on the landing. "Oh, Gerald." Cordelia glanced up at me with that sickening, honeyed smile. "Don't trouble your confused little head over all this commotion. We're only bringing in a few familiar things to make the house feel more like home while we look after you." I gave a slow, hollow nod and arranged my face into a blank, agreeable expression before melting back into the shadows of the upper hallway. But the true savagery of their occupation had not yet reached its worst. That afternoon, the house fell into an uneasy quiet as the movers finally cleared out. I was standing close to the balcony's edge, hidden behind the heavy velvet drapes, when sharp voices arose from the kitchen below. It was Renata, and her tone carried pure, undiluted venom. I peered down through the wrought iron balusters and saw her backing Lucia into a corner. Lucia, my loyal housekeeper. She had been part of this family for over 20 years. She had helped Nadine tend the garden. She had baked cookies for Colton when he was still a little boy. She was a woman of unimpeachable character, quiet, gentle, and devoted, who knew every room of this estate and loved it every bit as fiercely as I did. Renata had positioned herself mere inches from Lucia's face, holding up a small, decorative silver spoon that normally sat on the dining room buffet. "I found this stuffed at the bottom of your cleaning caddy." Renata's voice vibrated with a carefully performed fury. "I've had my suspicions for weeks that things have been disappearing around here. My father-in-law's mind is going, and you thought you could exploit that to line your own pockets. You figured no one would notice silver vanishing from a confused old man." Lucia stood rooted to the spot, her dark eyes wide with shock and disbelief. She shook her head desperately, her hands white-knuckling the hem of her apron. "Mrs. Renata, please, no," Lucia pleaded, her voice fracturing with genuine anguish. "I would never take a single thing from Mr. Gerald. I have served this family for 2 decades. I polished that spoon this very morning and must have dropped it into the caddy without thinking. It was an honest mistake, I swear it on my life. I have never stolen anything. Please, you have to believe me. Mr. Gerald knows me. He knows I am an honest woman." She cast her eyes upward toward the ceiling, silently praying I would step forward and speak for her. "Don't drag him into this," Renata snapped, closing the distance and invading Lucia's space. "He doesn't even know what day it is. I'm running this household now, and I will not have a thief under my roof. Gather your things immediately. You're fired. If you are not off this property within exactly 1 hour, I will call the police and have you charged with grand larceny, and I will make certain you never find work in this city again. Go, now." Lucia let out a choked, broken sob. Her shoulders caved beneath the weight of the accusation. She pressed her hands over her face and turned away, fleeing down the service corridor toward her small quarters. I witnessed the entire brutal exchange from the top of the stairs. My hands locked around the mahogany banister so tightly the knuckles went bone white. Every inch of my body was shaking, but not from the frailty of old age. I was trembling with a suppressed rage so fierce it threatened to swallow me whole. Renata had not dismissed Lucia because she believed anything had been stolen. She had dismissed her because Lucia was loyal to me. Lucia was the last person in this house who genuinely cared about my welfare, the only one who might think to question the medical story they were spinning. By removing her, they were cutting my final thread of connection to the outside world. They were methodically isolating me, stripping away the staff I trusted, so I would have no choice but to depend entirely on them and their bought physicians. It was a textbook isolation play, executed with breathtaking cruelty against a blameless woman who had devoted her whole working life to this family. I wanted to charge down those stairs. I wanted to seize Renata by the collar and hurl her and her parasitic mother out into the driving rain. I wanted to shred the fraudulent power of attorney and watch the blood drain from their greedy faces. But I forced myself to stay hidden in the shadows. The trap had not yet fully closed. If I dropped my mask of frailty now, the whole operation would fall apart before its time. I pulled back from the railing and withdrew into the absolute privacy of my master suite. I turned the heavy oak door's lock behind me and crossed to my bedside safe. From it, I retrieved my personal, untraceable mobile phone, a device Colton had no idea existed. My hands were rock steady as I composed a message to Lucia's personal number. I had to reassure her without fracturing the facade I had so carefully built. I could not allow her to leave believing the family she had loved for 2 decades had simply abandoned her. I kept the text brief and made sure the tone carried the full, unambiguous authority of the real Gerald Whitfield reaching out through the darkness. I typed the final words and pressed send, watching the delivery icon blink onto the screen. Take a 2-week paid vacation. I am cleaning house. The small check mark that appeared confirmed Lucia had received it. That digital tick was in the quiet vow of the reckoning still to come. I locked the encrypted phone back inside the biometric safe and sealed it away. The days that followed bled into one another in a grinding trial of psychological endurance. From Sunday through Wednesday, I suffered through the exhausting theater of my own supposed mental disintegration. I shuffled through the sprawling hallways, shoulders deliberately stooped, eyes kept perpetually dull and unfocused. I endured the grating sound of Cordelia redesigning the West Wing, her shrill voice flinging orders at the replacement domestic staff Renata had hired to fill Lucia's place. They treated my home like an occupied territory, uncorking my finest wines, rearranging my antique furnishings, and addressing me in the slow, over-enunciated tones one might use with a bewildered child. I swallowed every last drop of wounded pride, nodding emptily each time Colton patted my arm and assured me everything was going to be perfectly fine. He was utterly convinced my mind was disintegrating before his eyes, a convenient casualty of old age and fabricated neurological decay. He believed the $200,000 he had paid Dr. Cresswell was already delivering returns he could see with his own eyes. I needed that certainty to remain completely undisturbed. I needed his arrogance to keep swelling until it blinded him entirely. By Thursday evening, the air inside the mansion had grown thick with a sense of impending reckoning. The deadline for their hostile corporate takeover was drawing close. The fraudulent medical documents Colton had filed with the corporate board would trigger the emergency incapacitation clause by Friday afternoon. He was simply counting down the hours until he stood as the unchallenged master of an $800 million empire. It was time to give him precisely what he was waiting for, gift-wrapped in a perfectly staged illusion of surrender. The sky beyond the tall estate windows had deepened to a bruised, stormy purple, a fitting match for the darkness gathering inside the house. I instructed the temporary staff to build a roaring fire in the grand library, a room that had been my private refuge for decades. I drew a heavy leather armchair up directly before the crackling flames. I pulled a heavy wool herringbone blanket tight around my shoulders and let a visible shiver move through me, suggesting a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I let my jaw go slack and fixed my eyes in a blank, glassy stare at the hypnotic play of the firelight. When the scene was perfectly composed, I pressed the intercom button on the mahogany side table, my trembling finger slipping once before it made contact. My voice came out as a thin, reedy whisper carried faintly through the mansion's internal speakers. "Colton Renata." I called, threading a pathetic, wavering desperation through every syllable. "Could you please come to the library? I need to speak with you both. It's very important." I released the button and waited, my heart striking its beat with a slow, lethal steadiness. Fewer than 2 minutes passed before the heavy oak doors of the library groaned open. Colton and Renata stepped into the dimly lit room, their silhouettes carved against the hallway light behind them. They traded a quick, calculating look before crossing toward my chair. Renata smoothed the front of her expensive silk dress while Colton hastily rearranged his expression into a mask of deep, paternalistic concern. "Dad, are you all right?" Colton asked, dropping to one knee beside my chair and laying a firm hand on my blanket-covered arm. "You look terribly pale. Should we call the doctor?" I turned my head toward him with deliberate slowness, allowing a single strategic tear to gather at the corner of my eye. I reached out from beneath the heavy wool blanket and took his hand in weak, trembling fingers. "I am so tired, son," I whispered, my voice fracturing perfectly on that last word. "I am just so incredibly tired. The days are growing so muddled, and my mind simply isn't what it used to be. Everything feels like a dense fog." I let the pause linger, allowing my gaze to drift over to Renata, who stood slightly behind her husband, eyes wide with a predatory, breathless anticipation. She could sense the victory. She could already taste the absolute control. I turned back to Colton and pressed his hand weakly. "I have been thinking about the future, Colton. About the company. About the estate. I cannot carry these burdens any longer. It is all too much. I need to know that you and Renata are protected. I need my legacy secured before the fog closes in for good. Colton leaned closer, his breath catching slightly in his throat. He was utterly captivated by my performance, swallowed whole by the illusion of my total defeat. What are you saying, Dad? We are here for you. We will handle everything. I know you will, I murmured, releasing a long, shuddering sigh. That is why I have reached a decision. Bring the corporate notary tomorrow at exactly 2 in the afternoon. Have Edmond Lacroix draw up the final transfer protocols. I want to formally sign the company, the liquid assets, and this entire estate over to you. I want to hand you absolute legal control while I still have the clarity left to do it. The silence in the library was complete, broken only by the snapping of the fire. Colton stared at me, his pupils wide with pure, undiluted greed. He had spent 8 months laundering millions to settle Cordelia's staggering gambling debts. He had bribed a corrupt neurologist to have me declared incompetent. He had engineered a hostile corporate takeover, and now I was simply placing the crown in his outstretched hands. He didn't have to fight for it. He didn't have to wait for the corporate bylaws to engage. The golden goose was voluntarily baring its neck to the blade. Are you absolutely certain, Dad? Colton asked, his voice trembling with barely contained excitement. This is a monumental decision. We want whatever makes you comfortable. I gave a slow nod, letting my eyes fall closed as though the mere effort of speaking had depleted the last of my reserves. I am certain, buddy, I whispered, deploying that despised childhood nickname one final time to seal the illusion of my cognitive collapse. Now tomorrow at 2. Please just let me rest now. Colton patted my arm twice, rose to his feet, and pulled Renata close at the waist. They backed quietly out of the library, murmuring hollow reassurances and soft goodnights. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the room back into shadow. The instant the latch engaged, the frail and trembling old man evaporated entirely. I flung the heavy wool blanket from my shoulders and pushed up out of the leather armchair. I moved to the roaring fire and stood gazing into its heart. My posture was perfectly straight. My hands were completely steady. The trap was meticulously laid, and the rats were charging headlong toward the bait. When they arrived tomorrow at 2 with their notary expecting to inherit a kingdom, they would find the wolf standing in its place. Friday afternoon settled over the estate with a heavy, suffocating stillness. The antique long-case clock in the corridor ticked with slow, measured precision, counting down the final minutes of my son's brief and borrowed reign. It was 10 minutes to 2. I sat in my wheelchair near the edge of the formal living room, my legs draped beneath a heavy wool herringbone blanket. My chin rested against my chest, and my eyes hung half shut, a convincing portrait of a broken, compliant victim. But behind those half-closed lids, my mind was a steel trap, capturing every detail of the grotesque theater playing out before me. The living room had been converted into the staging ground for a bloodless coup. Colton stood beside the marble fireplace, radiating a nervous, sickening energy. He wore a bespoke navy wool English suit that reeked of unearned confidence. He glanced repeatedly at his heirloom silver pocket watch, tapping a polished shoe against the Persian rug. Renata and Cordelia occupied the velvet sofa together, looking less like family and more like vultures stationed above a dying animal. They had dressed for a coronation. Renata wore a sleek pearl-white designer gown that clung to her frame, while Cordelia had festooned herself in an obscene quantity of gaudy diamonds and a severe crimson dress. They were practically vibrating with toxic, giddy anticipation. Gathered near the grand piano stood the architects of my supposed ruin. Dr. Cresswell, the distinguished neurologist who had bartered away his medical oath for $200,000, stood nursing a crystal tumbler of sparkling water. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair immaculately groomed. He projected an aura of unshakable medical authority, an impressive disguise for a man who had long since abandoned any moral compass. Beside him stood a short, balding man clutching a thick leather briefcase against his chest. The notary, undoubtedly a corrupt associate Colton had procured to stamp the final seals on my financial execution. At exactly 5 minutes to 2, Colton crossed to the mahogany bar cart and lifted a chilled bottle of vintage champagne. The sharp crack of the cork rang through the cavernous room, the sound of premature triumph. He filled 5 crystal flutes with the bubbling golden liquid and distributed them among his accomplices. He passed me over entirely, leaving me sitting in the shadows as though I were already gone. I watched as they clustered near the center of the room, their voices falling into hushed conspiratorial whispers. I slowed my breathing and sharpened my hearing, drawing in every word. They were so consumed by their own greed, so utterly convinced of my mental dissolution, that they barely troubled themselves to lower their voices. Cordelia raised her champagne to her lips, her hand trembling faintly, the desperation beneath her arrogant surface betraying itself. "We wire the funds to Macau the very second the ink is dry on those transfer documents." Cordelia hissed, her voice tight with terror and anticipation. "I spoke to their intermediaries this morning. They are losing patience, Colton. We cannot afford a single delay with the banking." Colton nodded with practiced confidence, swirling his champagne. "Don't worry about the syndicate, Cordelia. The emergency incapacitation clause gives me complete unrestricted command over the primary holding accounts. The board secretary received Dr. Cresswell's medical affidavit yesterday. Once the notary seals these final signature waivers, the entire $800 million treasury is mine to direct. I will have the $4.5 million wired offshore by 3:00, and we will still have hundreds of millions left to work with. We are absolutely untouchable." Renata laughed, a bright, chilling sound that sliced through the heavy air. She let her gaze slide over to me, her eyes moving across my slumped and pathetic silhouette with pure, undiluted contempt. "And what do we do with him?" she asked, tilting her champagne flute vaguely in my direction. "I don't want him shuffling around the house all weekend. It's completely depressing." Dr. Cresswell stepped forward and adjusted his silk tie. "Glenbrook Memory Care is expecting a secure transport vehicle at 4:00, he announced in his smooth, practiced baritone. "The private suite is fully prepared. They specialize in severe dementia cases. Once he is admitted under my medical directive, he will be kept heavily sedated and comfortably isolated. You will never have to contend with his outbursts or his wandering again." The notary cleared his throat nervously, fingers tapping against his briefcase. "We simply need the documents executed cleanly," he murmured, his eyes flicking toward the heavy oak doors. "So long as he provides a physical signature or a verifiable thumbprint in my presence, the legal transfer of the estate and all corporate voting rights will be permanently binding. The court will recognize the medical power of attorney without question." They clinked their glasses together, sealing their wicked pact. They were toasting the theft of my life, the destruction of my freedom, and the total erasure of everything I had built. They believed they had outwitted a titan. They believed they could bleed my fortune dry to satisfy violent criminals and seal me inside a sterile room to decay until I drew my last breath. They had planned my funeral while I was still sitting in the chair breathing. I rested in my wheelchair, feeling the rough weave of the herringbone blanket beneath my palms. I did not feel fear. Sadness never entered into it. What settled over me was something colder and sharper, an absolute crystalline lucidity. The antique long-case clock in the corridor began its chime, the deep brass notes of 2:00 rolling through the grand living room and killing every whispered word. Colton placed his empty flute on the marble coffee table, the clink of crystal against stone cutting the air like a period at the end of a sentence. A nod to the notary was all it took. The man's briefcase snapped open, and a thick sheaf of legal documents came out. Dr. Cresswell repositioned himself nearby, projecting the practiced calm of objective medical oversight. Renata and Cordelia drifted toward the fireplace like moths toward a flame, eyes alight with the poisonous thrill of watching their scheme reach its finale. Colton approached my wheelchair slowly, a silver fountain pen held loosely in his fingers, his face already arranged into that performance of gentle fatherly solicitude. He went down on one knee before me and laid his hand on mine. "Dad." His voice came out soft, marinated in counterfeit warmth. "It is time. The doctors and the lawyers are here exactly as we talked about. We're going to handle all of this for you just the way you asked. All I need is your signature on a few documents, so we know you're safe and looked after." My chin stayed down, eyes fixed somewhere on the gleaming floorboards. I raised my right hand from beneath the blanket in a long, theatrical tremor. Colton's mouth spread into a slow, triumphant smile as he extended the pen toward me. He was certain the battle was won. He was certain the man he once knew had already departed. What he could not know was that Edmond Lacroix stood just beyond the estate gates at that very moment, federal investigators and corporate security at his side. I pulled one quiet, measured breath deep into my lungs and felt the full gravity of everything I had built flood back through me. The performance had run its course. The jaws of the trap were cocked and waiting, and every wolf in that room was already inside them. I made no move toward the pen. I let my shaking hand drift back to my lap and turned a slow, vacant look on Colton, the kind that belongs to a man who has misplaced the thread of his own thoughts. I murmured something about needing my reading glasses. They were in the study. I couldn't make out the lines without them. Colton, his entire focus tunneled onto securing my signature, gave an eager nod, squeezed my shoulder, and moved aside. I wheeled myself across the room, out through the corridor, and away from the wolves and their premature celebration. The doors of my private study closed behind me, and the frail old man ceased to exist on the spot. I got out of the wheelchair. The heavy wool herringbone blanket dropped to the floor. The threadbare cardigan and the shapeless pajama shirt came off next. What was waiting for me on the leather sofa was not clothing, it was armor. I put myself together with the deliberate calm of a man who has done this before: crisp white shirt buttoned to the throat, a deep cobalt silk tie drawn into a clean knot, and then the bespoke navy wool English suit, a garment built not for comfort, but for conquest. I stood before the antique mirror and ran a hand through my silver hair. The reflection that looked back carried no confusion, no trembling, no fog. Straight spine, cold eyes. The private side entrance to the study, the one that opens directly onto the garden, gave a soft, electronic tone as I pressed the release. Edmond Lacroix came through first, wearing the focused expression of a man on the hunt. He was followed by 3 senior members of my corporate board, their faces set in the hard, grim lines of men who had reviewed irrefutable evidence and drawn their conclusions. I had walked them through everything just hours before the forensic trail. The wire transfers the full architecture of Colton's embezzlement. Behind the board came 2 financial crimes detectives from the State Bureau, brass badges, picking up the low light. Nobody spoke. There was nothing that needed saying. We were all entirely clear on our purpose. I pushed the study doors open wide, and my leather soles found the hardwood of the corridor, each step landing with a sharp, deliberate authority. My entourage fell in behind me, moving in complete silence. We came through the entrance of the living room. At the precise instant, Colton had lifted his crystal flute to make a toast. Whatever words he intended never formed. The sound of celebration died so completely, it was as if someone had pulled the plug on the room itself. Colton's arm stayed in the air, suspended by disbelief, his eyes stretched wide at something that his mind refused to accept. The bent, shuffling figure he had been congratulating himself on breaking gone. Standing in that figure's place was the man who had constructed an $800 million empire with his own 2 hands. Renata's flute dropped from fingers that had forgotten how to hold anything. It hit the Persian rug and burst, champagne bleeding out across the wool in a spreading stain. Not one person reached for it. Cordelia made a strangled sound low in her throat, one hand flying to her mouth, her eyes cycling rapidly between my face and the detectives positioned at the entrance. Dr. Cresswell, the man who had sold his professional soul for $200,000, shed every ounce of that polished medical authority in less than a heartbeat. His complexion went the color of old ash. The notary pressed his briefcase against his chest like a shield and retreated one slow step toward the marble fireplace. "Hello, Colton," I said. No quaver, no frailty, just the full resonance of a voice that built boardrooms and broke rivals. "It turns out I don't need those reading glasses. I brought people who can review the paperwork for me." Colton's throat worked, but nothing came out. He looked at Edmond Lacroix. He looked at the board. He looked at the detectives. Every pillar of the world he had constructed was crumbling simultaneously. Then he finally managed the word coming out fractured and small. What is this? Why are there police here?" I moved deeper into the room, taking in the full panorama of broken faces before me. "This is not your house, Colton." I said each word placed with the care of a blade finding its mark. "And those officers have not come for conversation. They are here to pull apart a criminal enterprise that has been feeding off my corporate treasury." Edmund stepped to the center and drew the forensic audit files from his briefcase. "Let's talk about the emergency incapacitation clause, Colton," he said, his voice precise enough to etch glass. "More specifically, let's talk about the $200,000 you wired to an offshore account belonging to Dr. Cresswell payment for a fabricated diagnosis of stage 2 dementia." Dr. Cresswell convulsed as though struck. His tumbler rattled. "That is an absurd accusation," he managed, fighting for the wreckage of his dignity. "I am a board-certified neurologist. What you are describing is a gross violation of medical privacy." The senior detective produced a folded warrant and held it open. "We've had complete access to your wiped private server, Dr. Cresswell," he said, his voice carrying zero warmth. "The encrypted correspondence pricing out a fraudulent medical affidavit is fully recovered. You are under arrest, criminal conspiracy, medical fraud, and grand extortion." Dr. Cresswell sat down on the velvet sofa as though his legs had simply stopped working, head falling forward between his knees, his entire career's worth of reputation gone in 30 seconds. I shifted my gaze from the collapsed physician and brought it to bear on Cordelia. She was hyperventilating, the diamonds at her throat, rising and plunging with each shallow breath. "Now," I said, and the quiet in my voice was more frightening than any shout, "we come to the phantom vendors. $4.5 million, Colton. $4.5 million drained from my company through logistics contracts that never existed." Colton stumbled backward. "Dad, just please. Let me explain. The money was going toward investments. I was building something for the portfolio." I took that argument away from him. "You were moving capital to offshore VIP accounts in Macau," I said flatly. "Every dollar of it went to service the violent debts that woman ran up with the syndicates. You fed my life's work to the triads to keep this parasitic creature from facing the consequences of her own addiction." Cordelia came apart, a wretched sobbing wail tearing out of her as she buried her face in her palms. Renata wheeled on her mother with eyes full of equal parts betrayal and animal fear. The notary set his briefcase quietly on the floor and raised both hands toward the approaching officers, the gesture of a man who has calculated his odds and found them wanting. "It ends here, Colton," I said, watching the handcuffs come out. "Every account you control is frozen as of this moment. The power of attorney has been struck down. The board voted to remove you effective immediately. You spent years scheming to take my empire. What you have actually secured for yourself is a prison cell." I never raised my voice. The room did not require volume, it required exactness, and exactness had always been my particular gift. I crossed to Edmund and took the leather-bound folder he held out. I set it on the coffee table in front of them, not placed set. The impact of it carried through the glass and made every remaining champagne flute shiver. The sound landed like a gavel on a judge's bench. "Everything inside that folder is the complete, unredacted financial history of your miserable little conspiracy," I said, my voice dropping to a quietly lethal register that seemed to lower the temperature of the room itself. "Every unauthorized transaction, every buried email, every offshore routing number you were foolish enough to believe couldn't be found. Let us start with you, Cordelia. The woman recoiled as though I'd thrown something at her. Her fingers flew to her diamond necklace and clutched it there, her chest heaving in shallow, frantic bursts. I held my gaze on her without blinking. You were $3.2 million in debt to a violent gambling syndicate operating out of Macau. I let each word land separately, like a blade finding a new wound with each stroke. You decided my son could drain my corporate accounts on your behalf, that my life's work was nothing more than a reserve fund for your squalid indulgences. We have the wire transfers, Cordelia. We have the digital signatures. We have the encrypted correspondence linking your offshore shell companies directly to the syndicate's operatives. Cordelia made no attempt at denial. She couldn't locate a single word of defense. Her legs simply quit beneath her, and she crumpled into the nearest armchair, face buried in both hands, producing the loud, heaving, ugly sobs of a woman who has run out of options. The imperious queen of the social circuit reduced in a matter of seconds to a frightened criminal waiting to learn her sentence. I shifted my attention to the two men still frozen near the fireplace. Edmond Lacroix moved forward, drawing a separate file from his briefcase and spreading the papers, each bearing official medical seals where the detectives could examine them. These are the fabricated evaluations describing a fictional diagnosis of advanced stage dementia. Edmund announced, his voice carrying the righteous edge of a man about to close a case. They were signed and certified by Dr. Cresswell, who collected a substantial illicit payment for his perjury, and they were stamped by this notary who knowingly ratified forged signatures to circumvent standard corporate governance. The two financial crimes detectives moved without hesitation, swiftly, and with a practiced, almost mechanical efficiency that left no room for protest. The taller one took Dr. Cresswell by the shoulder, turned him firmly, and brought his hands together behind his back. The click of the handcuffs rang through the silent room. The doctor didn't struggle. He stood with his eyes fixed on the floor, as everything he had spent his career building, the reputation, the income, the freedom, vanished in a single moment. The second detective crossed to the notary, who had already dropped his briefcase, and thrust his trembling hands into the air, filling the silence with a stream of desperate, murmured apologies that went entirely unacknowledged. He was cuffed and guided toward the doorway beside the disgraced physician. Colton had not moved. He stood completely rigid. That bespoke suit he'd worn with such arrogant pride now looked like a costume on a man who had forgotten what role he was playing. The smug, predatory confidence that had been written into his every gesture all week was simply gone, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed blankness of a man watching something irreversible bear down on him. He looked at the folder. He looked at the detectives. Then he looked at me. "Dad, please, you have to hear me out," Colton said, his voice climbing into a thin, desperate register entirely unlike his own. "I am your son. You can't do this to your own blood. We can make this right. I will return every single cent, every last dollar. I will spend whatever remains of my life making it good. Please don't let them take me." I looked at him and felt nothing at all. Whatever paternal bond he thought he could appeal to had been cut the moment he chose to treat me as something to be discarded. "You stopped being my son the day you decided I was a burden to be disposed of," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through his pleading. "But you didn't simply steal from me, Colton. You failed to read the one document that mattered above all others. You never understood the architecture of the very empire you were trying to seize." I gestured to Edmund, who withdrew a final heavy document from his briefcase. "This is the master charter of the Whitfield Family Trust," I said, watching what little color remained in Colton's face drain completely away. "It is a legally airtight structure built to guard my assets against external predators and internal betrayal alike. I revised it 5 years ago, long before you ever began plotting." Colton stared at the document. His lips moved without producing sound, his mind struggling to grasp the full dimension of what he'd walked into. I leaned toward him until there was no possibility of a missed word. The trust contains a specific irreversible countermeasure, I said quietly. It states unambiguously that any attempt to seize control of the estate or the corporate holding company through fraudulent medical incapacitation automatically and permanently triggers the absolute disinheritance clause. The words hung between us, dense and final as a tombstone. Colton stumbled back a step, as though the air itself had been snatched from the room. He understood now not merely that the trap had caught him, but that it had erased everything he thought he stood to gain. "You are stripped of everything, Colton," I said, my voice resonant with a finality that needed no amplification. "Removed from the company, excised from the trust, permanently disinherited. You hold no shares of stock, no claim to a single room of this estate, and no entitlement to 1 cent of my wealth. You leave here with nothing." The taller detective released his grip on Dr. Cresswell and walked toward my son. "Colton Whitfield," the detective said, his voice a flat, immovable baritone. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Colton did not fight. He did not shout. He simply extended his wrists and the cold steel closed around them. He was nothing more now than a hollowed-out shell of a man who had finally arrived at the destination his choices had always been building toward. Renata had been standing near the sofa watching her entire world come apart piece by piece. As the detective read Colton his Miranda rights, something inside her gave way completely. She dropped to her knees on the Persian rug, the pristine white of her designer gown spreading around her. She crawled toward my wheelchair, mascara tracking down her face in dark streaks. "Gerald, please, I am begging you." Renata wept, reaching up to take hold of the fabric of my trousers. "I had no part in the offshore accounts. I knew nothing about the gambling debts. That was all Colton and my mother. Please don't let them take everything. Where am I supposed to go? How do I survive this? Please show us some mercy. We are your family." I looked down at her kneeling at my feet. I remembered the cold viciousness in her voice as she fired Lucia. I remembered the gleeful appetite in her eyes when she spoke of having me sedated and locked away in a room to decay. Mercy was not something I had on offer. What I felt was the clean, settled weight of justice delivered exactly where it belonged. I reached down slowly and unwrapped her fingers from my trousers, setting her hands aside with a deliberate contempt that required no words. I straightened the cuffs of my bespoke navy wool English suit and surveyed the 3 broken figures occupying my living room. "I believe the time has come for me to go to a nursing home." I said, each word placed like a blade delivered in a voice as cold and still as deep winter. "You will all have ample opportunity to reflect on your choices. The 3 of you can work out how to cover your legal fees from inside a prison cell." The heavy oak doors closed behind the detectives as they escorted what remained of my former family out of this house. The strangling tension that had occupied these rooms for weeks lifted instantly, displaced by the profound and absolute quiet of total victory. 3 months later, the wreckage of that afternoon had fully settled. Justice tends to move at a deliberate pace for ordinary men. But when an $800 million corporate legal team is supplying the fuel, the machinery accelerates to something close to merciless. Colton's trial was highly publicized and showed him no quarter. Faced with a towering accumulation of forensic evidence, offshore routing records, wire transfer logs, and the damning cooperation of Dr. Cresswell, who agreed to testify against him in exchange for a reduced sentence on his medical fraud charges, my son had nowhere to go. His defense attorneys counseled an unconditional guilty plea. The presiding judge had little patience for a privileged corporate heir who had attempted to rob his own father. Colton received 6 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. He exchanged his bespoke navy wool suits for a coarse orange uniform and a concrete cell, a place where his arrogance bought him nothing at all. The fallout for Renata and her parasitic mother proved equally total and merciless. The instant Colton was indicted and his accounts frozen, Renata filed for divorce, a calculated retreat from a sinking vessel. But the maneuver did not save her. The Internal Revenue Service, directed by our forensic audit findings, came down on both women with the focused appetite of something that had been waiting a very long time. Every designer handbag, every extravagant piece of jewelry, and each luxury vehicle acquired with stolen corporate funds was methodically seized by federal agents to satisfy the embezzlement debts and the mounting tax penalties. Shorn of their pilfered wealth and cast out by the very social circles they had spent years clawing their way into, they were removed from their upscale neighborhood entirely. Edmond Lacroix's office recently forwarded me a brief, deeply satisfying report, confirming that the two women now share a cheap, deteriorating motel room on the gray outskirts of the city, scraping by on minimum wage work just to keep themselves fed. The false queens had been permanently dethroned. With the parasites excised from my life, I turned to the work of genuine restoration. The very first thing I did upon reclaiming full, uncontested command of my estate was to find Lucia. I dispatched my private driver to her modest apartment and brought her to my corporate office. When she came through the door, her kind eyes still carried the weight of the undeserved shame Renata had branded her with. I rose from my chair, poured her a cup of tea, and offered her my personal apology for the cruelty she had suffered inside my home. I reinstated her as head of household staff, with her salary doubled and a fully funded retirement trust established in her name. The gratitude in her eyes, raw and overwhelmed and genuine, reminded me that real loyalty is the scarcest and most precious currency a man can hold, and it demands to be fiercely guarded. Even so, I could not remain in that sprawling suburban estate. The grand corridors and the manicured grounds had been permanently darkened by the memory of Colton and Renata moving through the shadows, sizing up the rooms for their takeover. I placed the property on the private market without ceremony, and the mansion, along with its contents, sold within weeks. In its place, I acquired a breathtaking, ultra-modern penthouse at the heart of downtown Philadelphia, soaring floor-to-ceiling windows, sleek marble underfoot, and an unobstructed panoramic sweep of the city stretching out in every direction. It is a fortress of glass and steel sealed off from the poisoned memories of everything that came before. The embezzled $4.5 million fully recovered from the frozen Macau syndicate accounts was never going to find its way back into my corporate treasury. That tainted capital belonged somewhere else entirely. I directed every cent of it into a new, heavily endowed philanthropic foundation. At its center, I established a prestigious, fully funded business scholarship in Nadine's name dedicated to brilliant young women from underprivileged backgrounds who have the hunger and the intellect to make their mark in the corporate world. My late wife's generosity and fierce intelligence will go on shaping lives long after mine has ended. Now I stand alone in the quiet elegance of this new penthouse. The sun is going down, and it is laying a brilliant wash of gold across the Philadelphia skyline. If you have stayed with me this long, then you already know how this story ends. Not with shouting, not with begging, with precision. Looking back on everything, the lonely birthday table, Nadine's brooch pinned to another woman's blouse, the forged documents, the bribed doctor. I understand now what it truly cost me. Not money, not a house. It cost me the illusion that blood guarantees loyalty. That is a painful thing to lose. But I believe God does not allow that kind of reckoning to come into your life without also giving you the strength to meet it. The timing felt cruel. Looking back, it was a mercy. It stripped away every false thing and left only what was real. Here is what I would tell any man or woman sitting where I once sat. First, never confuse proximity with loyalty. The people closest to your life are not always closest to your heart. Watch what they do when they think you are not watching. Second, silence is not weakness. Gerald Whitfield did not win by shouting across a restaurant. He won by saying nothing and preparing everything. Third, protect your legal architecture before you need it. An ironclad trust updated 5 years in advance was worth more than any confrontation could have been. Fourth, when you reclaim what is yours, Use it for something that outlasts you. Every dollar recovered from that syndicate went into a scholarship bearing Nadine's name because legacy built on generosity cannot be stolen. If this story moved you, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are not yet part of this community, subscribe to Dad Revenge. There are more stories waiting, each one a reminder that it is never too late to stand up. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.